A broke immigrant bought an abandoned house. Then strangers started showing up. Mateo thought buying this abandoned house would finally end his problems. No landlord, no questions, just walls and a roof he could afford. He was broke, undocumented, and sleeping in his car the week before. The house smelled like dust and old rain, but one light bulb was already on. The first night, someone knocked, then another night. Always strangers, always asking the same thing. Is he still here? No names, no explanations, just eyes that scanned the hallway behind Mateo. Inside the house, a door stayed locked, even though Mateo never locked it. And every morning, something inside had been moved. So who were these people really looking for? And why did this house feel like it was waiting for him to leave? Or disappear? Mateo stood frozen in the narrow hallway long after the knocking stopped, listening to the house settle, as if it were breathing around him. The walls were thinner than he expected, carrying the distant hum of traffic, and something else he could not place, a faint pressure in his ears. He told himself it was just an old structure adjusting to a new body inside it, the way abandoned things resist being used again. His hands shook as he lowered them from the door, and he hated how visible that weakness felt even though no one was watching. For weeks he had trained himself not to react, not to draw attention, not to exist too loudly in any space. The knock had violated that discipline in a single second, reminding him how little control he truly had. He walked deeper into the house, every step measured, afraid of what noise might summon. The light bulb at the end of the hall flickered once, as if acknowledging him, then steadied. He slept poorly on the bare mattress he had dragged him from the curb, waking to every sound the house made. The locked door at the end of the corridor occupied his thoughts, its presence heavy even in the dark. He was certain he had never touched the knob, yet it felt intimate, like something that already knew his name. When dawn came, pale and hesitant, he noticed a chair he had leaned against the wall now sat in the middle of the room. He stood there staring at it, trying to reconstruct the night, but his memory dissolved into blank stretches of exhausted sleep. Panic rose in him, sharp and familiar, the same panic he felt when border sirens wailed miles away. He checked every window, every corner, finding nothing disturbed except that single chair. The house smelled different in the morning, less like dust and more like damn paper. Mateo told himself stress could move objects in the mind, if not in reality, and repeated it until it almost sounded true. He spent the day cleaning, because cleaning gave him rules and outcomes he could trust. He wiped walls, swept floors, and filled black trash bags with the previous life of the place, broken glass and yellowed envelopes with names he did not recognize. The locked door remained untouched, collecting light without giving any back, its surface smoother than the others. He avoided it with deliberate care, like avoiding eye contact with a stranger who might ask questions. As he worked, he thought about the people who had knocked, their faces blurred together by fear, all sharing the same searching eyes. None of them had looked surprised to see him, only impatient, as if he were an obstacle rather than an answer. That unsettled him more than anger would have. By afternoon his arms ached, but the house looked marginally less hostile, as if it tolerated his effort. When he finally sat down, the silence felt thicker than before, weighted with expectation. Night returned too quickly, bringing with it the same tightness in his chest he used to feel sleeping in his car. He left a single light on, unable to bear the idea of darkness claiming the rooms entirely. The knock came later this time, slow and deliberate, each impact echoing longer than it should have. Mateo approached the door, knowing he should not open it, knowing that avoidance had kept him alive before. Through the peephole, he saw a woman in her 40s, her hair pulled back too tightly, her expression strained by something older than impatience. When he opened the door just enough to speak, she did not look at him first, but passed him down the hall. She asked the same question in a tired voice, the words practiced and worn thin. Mateo told her no, because he did not know what else to say. Her shoulders sagged slightly before she turned away without another word, leaving him colder than if she had shouted. Sleep abandoned him completely after that, and he lay on the mattress staring at the ceiling, counting the cracks. He wondered what kind of person someone had to be to inspire such persistence from strangers, and why they all believed he might still be here. The house responded to his thoughts with small sounds, a pipe ticking, with contracting, noises that felt too responsive to be random. At some point, he realized the locked door was no longer than the hall, but slightly ajar. He sat up so fast his head spun, staring at the thin line of darkness it revealed. He knew with absolute certainty that he had not moved it, and the certainty was worse than doubt. The air near that door felt cooler, denser, like a hell breath. Mateo stayed where he was until dawn, afraid that crossing the floor would be crossing some invisible boundary. Morning light showed the door close again, solid and unmoved, as if the night had lied to him. He laughed once, a short, humorless sound, and pressed his palms into his eyes until he saw stars. Hunger drove him outside, and the street looked ordinary enough to insult his fear. Neighbors walking dogs, a bus hissing to a stop. At a corner store he bought bread and coffee, the cashier barely glancing at him, which should have been a relief. Instead, he felt exposed, as if everyone could sense the house waiting behind him. When he returned, the light was still on, glowing softly in the dim interior. On the floor beneath it lay a set of keys he had never seen before, old and mismatched, their metal dulled by years of use. He picked them up, feeling their weight settle into his palm like a decision. The keys fit the locked door perfectly, sliding in with a smoothness that suggested familiarity. Mateo stood there for a long time, his forehead resting against the wood, breathing in the smell of old paint and something faintly metallic. He thought of all the locked doors in his life, the offices he could never enter, the borders that refused him passage. Opening this one felt like tempting a punishment he did not yet understand. He told himself knowledge was safer than ignorance. That uncertainty was what had kept him running. With a slow twist, he turned the key until the lock clicked open. The sound echoed to the house, final and irreversible. As he pulled the door back, he realized the room beyond was empty except for a single photograph on the floor, and the face staring up at him looked disturbingly familiar. So why did it feel like the house had been waiting for him to recognize it? Mateo crouched and picked up the photograph, the paper stiff and curling at the edges as if it had been handled too often and then abandoned. The man in the image was younger than Mateo, but carried the same hollow under the eyes, the same guarded tilt of the head that came from living without guarantees. He wore a work jacket with a stitched name that had been partially torn away, leaving only a few loose threads behind. The background showed the same house, unmistakable even years earlier, the porch railing intact and the paint less tired. Mateo felt a pressure in his chest as he studied the face, searching for a difference that would reassure him. The resemblance was not exact, but it was close enough to feel invasive, like a rumor told about his own life. He wondered who had taken the picture, and why it had been left for him to find. The room around him remained empty, stripped down to the studs, offering no answers. He closed the door again and slid down to sit on the floor, the photograph resting on his knees. His mind reached instinctively for explanations that would keep him safe, coincidences stacked carefully to form a fragile wall. He told himself people who lived on the margins often learned to look alike, shaped by the same fear and exhaustion. The knockers had asked if he was still here, not who he was, and that distinction mattered. Still, the keys in his pocket felt heavier now, as if they belonged to someone else. Mateo thought about the way the woman's eyes had softened when he said no, the relief mixed with disappointment. That look belonged to someone who had been waiting for a long time. He folded the photograph and tucked it into his jacket, unsure whether hiding it made him safer or more complicit. Over the next few days, the pattern continued, each night bringing a new stranger to the door. A man with oil-stained hands asked a question without meeting Mateo's gaze. A teenager with a nervous smile lingered as if expecting to be invited in, his eyes darting to the hallway before he left. Each time, Mateo answered the same way, and each time he felt less certain of what the truth even was. Inside the house, small changes accumulated. A cup moved from counter to table, A window unlatched then closed again. There were no signs of forced entry, no evidence he could show himself to prove his sanity. He began marking objects with pencil lines, tiny measurement of control that calmed his shaking hands. When those marks shifted, even by an inch, his stomach tightened with a dread he could not explain. During the day, he explored the neighborhood, tried to anchor himself in the ordinary world beyond the house. He spoke to no one longer than necessary, aware of how easily attention could turn dangerous. At the local library, he searched property records and old newspapers, his eyes burning from effort. The house had been sold and resold, passing through hands that never stayed long, each ownership ending quietly. One name appeared more than once, attached complaints and unpaid fines, then vanishing from the record entirely. Mateo copied it down, the letters unfamiliar but insistent. He wondered if saying it aloud would make it more real, more capable of finding him. When he returned home, the light was still on, steady and patient, as if it had never considered going out. That evening, a knock came earlier than usual, catching him mid-meal. The man at the door was older, his face lined by years of disappointment rather than age. He did not ask the question right away, instead studying Mateo with a careful intensity that made his skin prickle. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, almost respectful, and he asked if Mateo had found the room yet. Mateo felt something inside him give way, a crack spreading through his carefully built defenses. He demanded to know who the man was, and why everyone kept coming here. The man sighed and looked past him again, as if the house itself deserved the answer more than Mateo did. He said some places remembered the people who hid inside them, and then he corrected himself, saying people remembered, not places. The man introduced himself as Luis and told Mateo he had lived here once, briefly and desperately. He spoke of sharing the house with others who needed to disappear for a while, people running from debts, warrants, or worse. There had been rules, unspoken but strict, about silence and trust. One man had stayed longer than anyone else, careful and resourceful, using the house as a base rather than a refuge. Luis admitted they had lost track of him, that his departure had been sudden and unresolved. The photograph, Luis said, had been taken the week before that disappearance. Mateo listened, his fear slowly reshaping itself into something heavier and more complex. When he asked why they were looking now, Luis hesitated before answering. Luis explained that money had surfaced recently, tied to old names and forgotten accounts, drawing attention back to the house. People wanted answers, closures they could trade for relief or profit. Some believed the man had never truly left, that he had simply changed faces and routines. Mateo felt a cold understanding settle over him, the realization that survival often required becoming indistinct. He thought about his own habits, the way he kept his head down, avoided patterns, erased himself wherever possible. The house had not chosen him, he saw now, but it had recognized something familiar. Luis's eyes held apology and warning in equal measure. Before leaving, he told Mateo that staying too long in someone else's hiding place was dangerous. After Luis left, Mateo wandered through the house, touching walls that now felt charged with history rather than threat. He imagined bodies sleeping on floors, whispered conversations, plans made in the dark. The locked room no longer felt empty, but crowded with absence. He took out the photograph again and studied the face with a new understanding. The resemblance no longer felt accidental, but aspirational, a template for vanishing. Mateo wondered how many parts of himself he had already given up without noticing. The house seemed to hum softly around him, a sound that could have been the refrigerator or his own pulse. He realized the question was no longer who they were looking for, but who they might mistake him for if he stayed. That night, he did not sleep, sitting instead by the window and watching the street. No one knocked, and the silence felt deliberate, like a test. Mateo packed his few belongings into a bag, moving slowly as if the house might object. He hesitated over the photograph, then slipped it into his pocket again, unable to leave it behind. At dawn, he stood in the doorway, looking back at the light that had guided him through fear and false safety. The house looked smaller in the morning, less ominous and more tired. Mateo understood then that refuge and trap were often the same thing, distinguished only by time. He stepped outside, asking himself whether leaving meant freedom or simply another version of disappearance. Mateo did not get far before the weight of the house followed him, settling into his thoughts like a second shadow. He walked the streets with his bag slung over his shoulder, every step measured, every sound a possible signal. The neighborhood looked unchanged, but his perception of it had shifted, as if a hidden map now overlaid familiar streets. He stopped at a bus stop and sat, watching people pass with their small certainties, coffee cups and schedules anchoring them to lives that allowed visibility. His phone remained silent, a useless object he kept mostly for the comfort of its presence. He thought about Luis's warning and the way it had been delivered without judgment, as if disappearance were simply another tool some people learned to use. Mateo wondered how many times he had already erased himself to survive. The realization did not bring relief, only a deeper fatigue. By afternoon, hunger and indecision drove him back toward the house, a choice that felt both inevitable and foolish. He told himself he needed to retrieve a few things he had forgotten, though he knew that was a lie. The front door opened easily, the light still on, unchanged by his brief absence. Inside, the air felt different, less tense, as if the house had been waiting to see what he would do. Mateo moved slowly, checking each room, noting with unease that nothing seemed out of place. The quiet pressing on him, more unsettling than the knocks had been. He sat at the small table and ate mechanically, listening to the refrigerator cycle on and off. The house no longer felt hostile, but that familiarity carried its own danger. That evening, a knock came again, softer than before. Mateo opened the door to find a young woman standing there, her face tight with restrained emotion. She introduced herself as Anna and asked if she could come in, her eyes already drifting down the hallway. Against his better judgment, Mateo stepped aside, allowing her entry. She moved through the space with practiced ease, pausing near the locked room as if sensing its significance. Anna explained she had known the man from the photograph, though she did not say his name. She spoke of favors owed and promises broken, of years spent waiting for news that never came. Her voice carried anger, but beneath it lay something like grief. Anna told him the man had helped her once, providing shelter when she needed it most. He had been careful, always preparing for the moment he would have to vanish. When he left, he had taken something valuable, something that tied several people together in ways they would rather forget. Mateo listened, feeling the story tighten around him. Anna admitted she did not believe the man was still here. Not really, but places like this made it hard to let go of the idea. She looked at Mateo then, truly seeing him for the first time, and her expression softened. She said he reminded her of him, not in appearance, but in the way he occupied space, cautious and temporary. The comparison felt like a verdict. After Anna left, the house seemed to exhale, as if relieved to be alone again. Mateo sat on the floor of the locked room, its emptiness now loud with implication. He thought about the money Luis had mentioned and the object Anna had avoided naming. The idea that something valuable might still be hidden here unsettled him, not because he wanted it, but because possession invited attention. He imagined the man planning his escape, choosing what to carry and what to abandon. The photograph suddenly felt like an intentional artifact, a decoy or a message. Mateo wondered if the man had anticipated someone like him finding it. The house had become a crossroads of unfinished business, and Mateo stood at its center. Sleep came in fragments, filled with dreams of corridors that rearranged themselves and doors that led nowhere. When he woke, the light had gone out for the first time since his arrival. The darkness felt significant, like a decision made without his input. He stood and turned the switch, relieved when the bulb flickered back to life. In that moment, he understood the house did not need him, but it had use for him. He felt a strange clarity settle over him, a sense that avoiding the truth would only prolong the danger. Mateo decided he needed to know what the man had taken and why it mattered. The choice felt less like courage and more like resignation. He returned to the library, digging deeper into records and whispers, piecing together fragments of a life lived in the margins. The man had moved between cities, names shifting slightly each time, leaving behind a trail of unresolved debts and quiet gratitude. Mateo recognized the pattern too well, the careful balance between helping others and staying untraceable. It occurred to him that survival often required alliances that could later become liabilities. As he left the library, he noticed someone watching him from across the street, their interest too focused to be casual. He kept walking, refusing to react to his heart hammering. The past was no longer content to remain buried. Back at the house, Matteo searched with new purpose, examining floorboards and walls for signs of concealment. In the locked room, he found a loose panel beneath the window, hidden by years of neglect. Behind it lay a small metal box, its surface scratched and dull. He held it carefully, aware that opening it might change everything. The box felt heavier than expected, not with weight, but with consequence. Matteo sat back against the wall, the house silent around him. He asked himself whether knowing the truth would free him, or bind him more tightly to a story that was never his. The box rested in his hands, waiting. Matteo did not open the box right away, because hesitation had kept him alive before, and he trusted it more than impulse. He set it on the table and circled it slowly, as if proximity alone might trigger some hidden mechanism. The metal was cold beneath his fingers when he finally touched it again, the surface etched with shallow scratches that spoke of being moved often and hidden quickly. He imagined the man deciding when to leave it behind, weighing risk against necessity. The house felt alert, its silence no longer passive but attentive, as though it were invested in what Matteo would choose. He thought of Anna's anger and Luis's tired caution, of strangers bound together by a secret that refused to stay buried. The box represented a debt unpaid, and debts always found ways to be collected. Matteo took a breath that scraped his lungs and lifted the lid. Inside were documents folded with deliberate care, their edges worn but intact. Names filled the pages, handwritten and typed, layered with dates and numbers that suggested patterns rather than transactions. Matteo recognized none of the names, but the repetition of certain addresses caught his eye, all tied to places like this one. There were also photographs, not people but of interiors, rooms marked with notes in the margins. The final item was a small flash drive taped to the bottom, its presence oddly modern against the paper. Matteo felt his stomach tighten as he realized the box was not money but leverage. Whatever the man had taken, it was information powerful enough to unsettle people who preferred obscurity. Matteo understood now why the questions had never included a name. He spent hours reading, piecing together a network of shelters and safe houses, informal and fragile, sustained by trust and necessity. The man had documented everything, not out of paranoia but strategy, creating insurance against betrayal. Matteo saw how easily such a system could collapse if exposed, how many lives balanced on discretion. He also saw why the man had needed to disappear completely, abandoning even the tools that had kept him safe. The realization brought a bitter admiration that made Matteo uncomfortable. He wondered if the man had believed someone else would find the box and know what to do. The thought that he might have been chosen, even accidentally, weighed heavily on him. The house felt smaller with each page he turned. That night, the knock returned, sharp and urgent, as if patience had finally run out. Matteo hid the box beneath the floor panel and approached the door with a calm that surprised him. The man outside wore a clean jacket and a polite smile that did not reach his eyes. He asked the question with practiced ease, already scanning past Matteo into the hall. Matteo answered no, and for the first time, the lie felt intentional rather than defensive. The man lingered, his gaze narrowing slightly, as if assessing the reliability of the response. He warned Matteo that some people did not appreciate unanswered questions, then left without waiting for a reply. The threat hung in the air long after the door closed. Sleep abandoned Matteo again, but this time his thoughts were sharp and focused rather than frantic. He considered his options with the clarity of someone who had nothing left to lose. He could leave and let the box be found by someone less cautious, or he could destroy it and erase a fragile history. Neither choice sat easily with him. The names in those documents represented lives like his own, precarious and invisible, surviving through mutual silence. Matteo understood that exposure would not just endanger individuals, but dismantle an entire informal refuge. He felt anger rise, not at the man who had created this burden, but at the systems that made such secrecy necessary. The house had become a moral crossroads he had never asked to stand on. In the morning, Anna returned, her expression hardening when she saw Matteo waiting for her. He showed her the box, watching the tension drain from her shoulders and be replaced by resignation. She admitted she had suspected its existence, though she had hoped it had been destroyed. They sat at the table together, the document spread between them like a shared confession. Anna explained the man had intended to use the information to force an end to certain abuses, but the plan had grown too dangerous. He had left the box here as a last resort, trusting the house to hide it longer than any person could. Matteo listened, recognizing the fatal optimism in that choice. He asked Anna what she thought should be done now. Anna argued for destruction, her voice tight with fear and fatigue. She said too many people had already suffered waiting for a closure that would never come. Matteo countered that erasing the record would only protect those who exploited the system. The debate circled without resolution, each option carrying its own kind of harm. The house listened, unmoved, its walls absorbing the argument as they had absorbed so many before. Matteo realized there was no clean outcome, only degrees of responsibility. He felt the weight of choice settle fully onto his shoulders. The box had outlasted its creator, and now it demanded a new keeper. That afternoon, a car idled across the street longer than necessary, its presence unmistakable. Matteo watched from the window as Anna slipped away, unwilling to be seen. He knew the search was tightening, patience thinning into aggression. The house that had once offered anonymity now marked him as a node in a dangerous network. Matteo felt fear, but beneath it was a steady resolve he had not known he possessed. He decided he would not run again without purpose. The house had taught him that hiding without direction only delayed the inevitable. As night fell, Matteo gathered the box in his bag, preparing for a different kind of departure, one that might finally answer the question everyone kept asking. Matteo left the house after sunset, choosing the hour when the neighborhood softened into routine and shadows, when people were less inclined to notice one more figure moving with purpose. He carried the box wrapped in an old towel, its shape disguised but its weight undeniable. The light inside the house remained on after he closed the door, a quiet defiance that felt almost protective. He did not look back twice, knowing hesitation would root him in place. Each step away from the porch felt like severing a thread he had not known was binding him. The street noises absorbed him quickly, and the house receded into anonymity behind him. Matteo felt a familiar tightening in his chest that came with motion, but this time it was sharpened by intent rather than panic. He took a bus across town, choosing a route that bent and doubled back on itself, watching reflections in the darkened windows. Every face felt like a possible mirror of pursuit, every pause a test of nerve. The city at night offered its own kind of shelter, crowds without intimacy, movement without memory. Matteo exited near an industrial district. Warehouses crouched like tired animals along the road. He walked until his legs burned, then farther still, until the streets thinned into silence. The box knocked softly against his hip, with each step, a reminder of the responsibility he had accepted. He wondered if the man had felt the same burden the night he decided to disappear. The thought steadied him. Matteo found refuge in a disused storage unit he had once cleaned for cash, its lock long broken and its contents forgotten. Inside, he sat on the concrete floor and opened the box again, the documents rustling softly in the stale air. He plugged a flash drive into an old laptop he kept hidden, watching files populate the screen. There were recordings, scanned letters, detailed timelines that mapped harm with unsettling precision. Matteo felt anger rise, hot and focused, replacing fear with something harder. This was not chaos but evidence, assembled with care by someone who believed in consequence. Matteo understood then that the man had not been running forever. He had been waiting for the right moment to stop. That moment had simply come too late. Over the next days, Matteo moved carefully, contacting organizations that existed in the gray spaces between legality and necessity. He chose them with the same caution he had learned crossing borders, trusting patterns more than promises. He shared pieces of the information anonymously, testing reactions, watching for signs of danger. Each exchange felt like stepping onto thin ice, but the ice held. Slowly, responses came back, measured and serious, asking for more. Mateo felt the story expanding beyond the house, beyond himself. He remained invisible, a courier rather than participant. For the first time in years, his invisibility felt like agency rather than erasure. The house appeared in his dreams, not as a threat, but as a witness. He saw its rooms filled again, not with fear but with quiet purpose, people sleeping without listening for knocks. The dream unsettled him because it suggested an ending he did not yet trust. When he woke, he checked his surroundings with practiced efficiency, ready to vanish if necessary. But no one came. The waiting stretched, taut and uncertain, until it began to feel like a held breath about to release. Mateo reminded himself that change moves slowly, especially when it threatened entrenched power. He held on to patience the way he once held on to survival. One afternoon, Anna contacted him through a secure channel he had not known she possessed. Her message was brief, cautious, and edged with disbelief. She told him people were talking, that investigations had begun quietly, carefully. Names from the box were surfacing in context that could not be ignored. Mateo felt a flicker of relief, quickly tempered by the knowledge that exposure invited retaliation. He warned her to stay away from the house, to let it remain what it had always been, a decoy for those chasing ghosts. Anna agreed, though her message carried a note of mourning, as if she were saying goodbye to a place that had once saved her. Mateo understood that loss too well. Days turned into weeks, and the city shifted around him, indifferent to his internal reckoning. He took temporary work, kept moving, never staying long enough to be remembered. The box grew lighter as its contents were disseminated, its purpose slowly fulfilled. Mateo kept a photograph, though folded and worn, a reminder of the man who had trusted the house more than people. He wondered if the man was still alive somewhere, watching events unfold from a safe distance. The possibility felt both comforting and unsettling. Mateo realized that stories like these rarely ended cleanly, but they did change shape. One evening, passing through a familiar street, Mateo saw the house from a distance. The light was finally off, the windows dark and unremarkable. It looked like any other abandoned place, stripped of its gravity. He felt a surprising ache, a sense of gratitude mixed with sorrow. The house had been a threshold, not a destination, and it had served its purpose. Mateo turned away, feeling the weight he carried shift into something more manageable. He knew strangers might still knock there for a while, asking the same question. This time, the answer would finally be no. Mateo sensed a change before he could name it, the way the air thickened when something long delayed finally began to move. The city felt less neutral now, every corner carrying the potential for consequence. He noticed unfamiliar cars parked too neatly, conversations that cut off when in a room, the subtle tightening of systems responding to disruption. None of it was dramatic enough to confirm fear, but together it formed a pattern he had learned to respect. He adjusted his routines, slept in different places, trusted fewer faces. The work he found became more sporadic, paid in cash and silence. He accepted the instability as a necessary cost, reminding himself that stability had always been conditional anyway. The story he had helped release was no longer contained, and containment had been the only thing keeping it safe. Messages began to arrive through indirect channels, some cautious, others urgent. People asked for clarification, for verification, for reassurance that what they were uncovering was real and not a trap. Mateo responded selectively, offering just enough to keep the process moving without revealing himself. He felt the strain of constant calculation, the mental arithmetic of risk and reward that never quite balanced. At night, he replayed the man's careful documentation in his mind, recognizing the discipline required to build such a record while remaining unseen. Mateo understood that the man had lived under the same pressure now settling over him. The realization brought an unwelcome intimacy, as if he were inheriting not just a task, but a life. He wondered whether this was how identities transferred, not through blood or name, but through responsibility. Anna sent another message, this one longer, stripped of caution by exhaustion. She wrote about people being questioned, about doors opening that had stayed shut for years. Some of the shelters listed in the documents were being approached quietly, offered protection in exchange for cooperation. Others were already empty, their inhabitants scattered by rumor and fear. Anna admitted she felt torn, relieved to see movement, yet guilty for the disruption it caused. Matteo read the message several times, weighing his reply. He told her disruption was inevitable when truth surfaced, that silence had only postponed harm. Even as he typed the words, he felt their inadequacy. He knew there were costs that no explanation could soften. One night, as rain slicked the streets and blurred the city into reflections, Matteo realized he was being followed. The awareness arrived without panic, a cold certainty shaped by experience. He did not change his pace, allowing the follower to believe their subtlety was effective. He led them through crowded streets and then into quieter ones, testing distance and intent. When he finally ducked into a narrow alley, he turned to find the space empty. The absence unsettled him more than confrontation would have. He understood then that he was no longer just a witness, but a variable, something to be accounted for. The story had grown teeth. Sleep became shallow and fragmented, filled with half-dreams of knocking doors and rooms without exits. Matteo's body carried the tension even when his mind tried to rest. He reminded himself why he had chosen this path, grounding the abstract danger in concrete faces and names. He thought of people who would never know his involvement, whose lives might shift slightly away from catastrophe because of information they would never see. The anonymity of that impact felt appropriate, even necessary. Matteo had never sought recognition. Survival had taught him the value of absence. Still, the isolation weighed on him, pressing in during the quietest hours. Weeks later, a message arrived from an unfamiliar address, its tone formal and restrained. It confirmed that formal proceedings had begun, carefully framed to avoid spectacle. The sender thanked an unnamed source for their cooperation and advised continued discretion. Matteo felt a cautious release in his chest, a sense that the story had crossed a threshold beyond which it no longer required him. He knew better than to believe danger vanished with progress, but the center of gravity had shifted. The box was now empty, its contents absorbed into systems larger than any one person. Matteo allowed himself a rare moment of stillness, sitting in a cafe and watching steam rise from his cup. The house returned to his thoughts again, not as a place, but as an idea. It had been a container for fear, hope, and unfinished plans, all layered into its walls. Matteo realized he had been drawn to it not because it was cheap or abandoned, but because it mirrored his own state, occupied by absence. He wondered how many other houses like it existed, quietly holding stories no one wanted to claim. The thought did not frighten him as it once would have. Instead, it felt like a reminder of continuity, of how lives intersected briefly before diverging. Matteo understood that telling this story, even indirectly, was part of that continuity. One evening, as he prepared to move again, Matteo found the photograph folded in his bag, its edges softened by time and handling. He studied the face with a gentler gaze, seeing not a template but a warning. The man had carried the story alone for too long, trusting walls over people. Matteo decided he would not repeat that mistake entirely. He reached out to one person he trusted, sharing just enough to no longer be alone with the knowledge. The act felt risky and necessary in equal measure. As he zipped his bag closed, Matteo felt the tension shift again, not toward danger this time, but toward resolution still out of reach. Matteo moved north as winter began to press down on the city, the cold providing both cover and urgency. People paid less attention when everyone was wrapped in their own discomfort, faces lowered, shoulders hunched. He took work where he could, unloading trucks before dawn, cleaning offices after midnight, jobs that ended without conversation. The physical exhaustion helped quiet his mind, even as the larger questions remained unresolved. He avoided places with screens, with news playing too loudly, but fragments still reached him through overheard conversations and half-read headlines. Investigations were widening, cautiously but steadily, and names were being spoken in rooms that once pretended ignorance. Matteo felt the strange attachment of someone watching consequences unfold from a distance. He was both responsible and absent, a contradiction he was learning to live with. Anna's messages grew less frequent, shorter, and more measured. She wrote once to say she was leaving the city, That staying felt like tempting a history she wanted to outgrow. Mateo understood that impulse intimately. Some places held on to you long after you left, and departure did not always mean release. He wished her safety without sentiment, knowing that excessive emotion could become a liability. When her messages stopped entirely, he assumed it was intentional. Silence, he had learned, was often an act of care. Still, the absence left a quiet hollow to which he paid more attention than he wanted to admit. The sense of being watched never fully disappeared, but it dulled, receding into something like background noise. Mateo accepted that vigilance was now a permanent condition, not a temporary response. He adjusted, refining routines, finding a rhythm that allowed for movement without panic. He learned which streets felt neutral, which faces were forgettable, which moments allowed for rest. In rare quiet hours, he reflected on how much of his life had been shaped by avoidance. The realization did not bring bitterness, only a sober clarity. Survival had been his first language, and everything else he had learned came after. One night, in a small rented room with a radiator that clanged unpredictably, Mateo dreamed of the house again. This time it was empty but clean, the walls stripped of residue, the floors bare and honest. Sunlight filled the rooms, revealing nothing hidden, nothing waiting. The locked door was gone entirely, replaced by an open frame that led nowhere in particular. He woke with the image lingering, a rare sense of peace threaded through familiar tension. Dreams, he knew, were not predictions, but they could reveal readiness. Mateo wondered if he was finally prepared to let the house exist as memory rather than influence. Weeks later, confirmation arrived indirectly that several cases had reached resolution. Settlements were being discussed. Charges filed quietly. Structures dismantled without spectacle. The story was being told in fragments, controlled and incomplete, shaped to protect those who would otherwise be crushed by exposure. Mateo felt relief tempered by the knowledge that justice, when it came, was always partial. Still, partial was more than nothing, and nothing had been a default for too long. He allowed himself to acknowledge that what he had done mattered, even if no one would ever know his name. The anonymity no longer felt like erasure, but like completion. He thought often of the man from the photograph, imagining him somewhere ordinary and unremarkable, perhaps watching similar news with the same guarded attention. Mateo hoped he had found rest, or at least distance. The idea that their lives had intersected without meeting no longer felt strange. Some connections existed only to transfer weight from one person to another. Mateo accepted that inheritance with a quiet seriousness. He also recognized where he differed, where he had chosen to pass the story forward rather than bury it. That difference, small as it seemed, felt significant. As spring approached, Mateo stood one evening on a bridge overlooking slow, dark water. He watched debris drift beneath him, carried by a current that did not care where things began. He understood then that the house had never been the center of the story, only a container holding pressure until someone intervened. What endured was not the place, but the act of choosing to respond rather than retreat. Mateo inhaled the cold air and felt the weight he carried settle into something sustainable. The story was nearly done with him, even if he would never be entirely done with it. He turned away from the water, ready for whatever remained, knowing one final step still waited ahead. Mateo understood the final step was not about distance or concealment, but about deciding what version of himself would remain once the movement stopped. He settled in a small town where anonymity was unremarkable rather than enforced, where people noticed routines more than histories. He found steady work repairing appliances, a skill he learned quickly because broken things followed rules. The predictability calmed him, offering a structure that did not depend on secrecy. He spoke little about his past, not out of fear this time, but because it no longer needed constant defense. The days accumulated quietly, each one adding weight to the idea that he could stay. Mateo let himself believe cautiously that permanence might be possible. One afternoon, while sorting through old belongings he had carried too long, he found the photograph again. The edges were frayed now, the image softened by time and handling. He studied the face without urgency, recognizing it as a marker rather than a mirror. The man had been a steward of secrets, shaped by necessity into someone who trusted walls more than people. Mateo felt no judgment toward him, only understanding. He realized that survival stories often ended not with triumph, but with transfer, the burden shifting to whoever arrived next. Mateo had arrived, and he had chosen not to keep the story contained. That choice felt like the true ending. News of the investigations faded from public conversation, absorbed into the slow machinery of outcomes and settlements. For those directly affected, life adjusted in small but meaningful ways, dangers reduced, options expanded. Mateo remained outside those narratives, his role complete. He accepted that closure did not require acknowledgement, only consequence. The absence of further messages confirmed what he already sensed. The story no longer needed him to move forward. He allowed himself to rest in that knowledge, a quiet satisfaction replacing vigilance. The silence this time felt earned. On an evening walk, Mateo passed a house with a single light glowing in an otherwise dark block. The sight tightened something in his chest before loosening it again. He understood now that places did not wait for people, but people waited for permission to leave places behind. The abandoned house had been a threshold, a convergence of unfinished lives and deferred decisions. It had offered him a question rather than an answer, and he had responded by choosing involvement over escape. That response, more than any document or evidence, was what endured. Stories survived because someone refused to let them disappear quietly. Mateo began to write, not formally and not for publication, but to keep the shape of what had happened intact. He wrote about the knocks, the locked door, the weight of deciding for others who would never know him. He wrote carefully, stripping names and details until only the truth of the experience remained. The act felt grounding, a way to release the last pressure held in his body. He understood that telling the story was not about preserving the past, but about preventing its repetition. Words, when chosen honestly, could outlast walls. Years later, Mateo would think of the house rarely, and when he did, it would no longer feel heavy. It would exist as a necessary place in a longer path, one he had walked without knowing where it led. He would remember the strangers and their question, and how the answer had changed meaning over time. Is he still here? Had once been a threat, then a test, and finally an echo. Mateo knew the answer now, in every sense that mattered. No, he was not still there, but what he left behind had not vanished. The story ended without spectacle, as most true stories did. There was no single moment of victory, only the accumulation of choices that leaned toward responsibility. Mateo accepted that some lives intersected briefly for reasons that became clear only afterward. He carried a residue without resentment, aware that meaning often arrived late. What remained was not fear, but a sober respect for the cost of silence and the courage required to break it. The house had been abandoned, but the story had not. Some stories survive only because someone chooses to tell them. Mateo had made that choice, quietly and completely, and then stepped aside to let the consequences unfold. He lived with the knowledge that anonymity could coexist with impact. That disappearance did not have to mean erasure. The waiting had ended, replaced by a life that did not depend on locked doors or unanswered questions. Mateo closed his notebook and turned off the light, knowing the story would continue without him, which was exactly how it should be. If you want more stories like this, subscribe to the channel and stay with us for the next one. Some stories only find you if you're willing to wait for them.